By discovering two young women's bodies buried in the back garden of this terraced house, the police were also discovering the truth about Peter Tobin. He is a serial sex attacker and killer.
They were told that in 1994, Peter Tobin had a conviction for raping a 14-year-old girl and sexually assaulting another, that he'd given them both sedatives.
To me, Peter Tobin clearly has some of the hallmarks of a clinical psychopath. Obviously, he lacks empathy from the very nature of his attacks and the fact that he would threaten to kill his own son. I think he's quite criminally versatile, so as well as the killings, he was involved in petty theft when he was younger. He's also sexually promiscuous. He's had multiple marriages. He would use sex workers on a regular basis.
Well, it's an interesting one. The distinction between a psychopath and a sociopath. A psychopath is always said to be charming, very skilled linguistically, often highly intelligent, but entirely lacking in any kind of empathy for his fellow human beings. The sociopath, by comparison, is often said to be someone who is caught up in rage, in violence, in extraordinary passion. He's much more likely, some say, to kill multiple times. Peter Tobin was born in Renfrewshire, just west of Glasgow in Scotland, in 1946. He was the youngest of 8 children, an Irish Catholic family. He was a very difficult little boy and soon got into trouble with law. In fact, he was sent to an approved school, what were then called approved schools for young offenders, and later to a young offenders institution. He was manipulative, cruel, calculating, and developed into an adult who was consistently in trouble with the law.
They were told that in 1994, Peter Tobin had a conviction for raping a 14-year-old girl and sexually assaulting another, that he'd given them both sedatives.
Peter Tobin chose to date younger women, and this could be for a number of reasons. It could be because he had a sexual proclivity towards young women, so he had paedophilic tendencies, and this is reflected by the fact that he would intentionally use emaciated sex workers later down the line. It could be that he knows that he's going to be able to dominate and control younger individuals because they've got less confidence, less life experience, less autonomy, less ability to make their own decisions. Or it could be that it actually plays into Tobin's narcissism. So he liked being in the position of being dominant, of being the mature one, of being the respected figure.
All psychopaths exhibit an extreme degree of narcissism, and narcissism is a complex phenomenon, but there are certain things that we can say are universal in narcissists, and I think firstly is a grandiose sense of themselves, grandiose sense of their own self-importance, which of course is linked to a great sense of entitlement, that an extreme narcissist will feel extremely aggrieved, homicidally aggrieved in a psychopathic narcissist, that they are being denied what they believe is rightfully theirs. And that could be material wealth, but more likely it's going to be emotional and psychological and sexual gratification. And if they are denied that, they will respond calamitously and murderously to that denial. And their narcissism really knows no bounds at all. And another factor of this narcissism is the complete lack of empathy that the psychopath feels for his victims.
Tobin was extraordinarily peripatetic. He always had jobs that involved driving round. He was a man who never sat still. And that, as often happens, unfortunately, and there are quite a long history of lorry drivers, for example, of cab drivers, who have a tendency to kill and get away with it because they're never in the same area very long. Tobin develops quite quickly a fairly unpleasant attitude to women.
Help us! Help! Help! They're hanging the English photograph!
Peter Tobin's first wife, when he was 22, she was 17. But when he was in his mid-30s, early to mid-30s, he married another woman who was only 16. And he had a real compulsion to control the women who came into his life. And like many psychopaths, he was superficially charming. There's a phrase called love bombing, and many women will have experienced this, where men can be effusive in their, over the top in their expressions of love, buying flowers, taking them out, being gratuitous in their expression of and the intensity of their affection. It's overwhelming. It also explains why psychopaths can sometimes make very thrilling, kind of prolific lovers and sexual partners, because their lack of impulse control and their need to control the other person is so overwhelming, they will do it in any way that they can.
Peter Tobin knocked the confidence from his younger girlfriends, and this is probably related to him just being sadistic and going on a bit of a power trip and getting some pleasure from humiliating them. It could also be a reflection of his own internal self, his own internal world, so maybe he had an inferiority complex. Also, Peter Tobin might have known that by gradually chipping away at their own self-confidence and their self-esteem, he would have made them more pliable and less resistive.
Well, Dinah McNichol had been missing for 16 years before her body was found here, buried in the back garden of what was Peter Tobin's Margate home. She'd been bound and gagged, and her body wrapped in rubbish bags. On those bags, police found 4 fingerprints, which they say matched Peter Tobin. They also found traces of an antidepressant drug in her bloodstream, a drug which was prescribed to Peter Tobin, the very same drug that was apparently used when he was later convicted of raping 2 14-year-old schoolgirls who were looking after his baby son.
So an interesting question is, are psychopaths self-aware? Do they understand their own abnormal behaviour? I would say that sometimes over a long period of time, or even the course of their lives, they understand that they don't have the same emotional connection with people as most others do. But I would say that's secondary insight. It's not that they feel that there's something wrong with them, it's just that they understand that they don't fit in compared to the rest of society.
Psychopaths are not always criminals. And you will find some successful psychopaths in the corporate world, some people being CEO, some being surgeon, lawyers, and some of the characteristics of psychopathy, like sometimes the lack of empathy or lack of remorse, like if they need to fire other people, when there are very high stake risk decision where they have to keep their cool, are characteristics that are very useful then to be successful in their own line of works.
So they'll do anything to gain promotion, to make their way up the hierarchy. They might lie about colleagues, they might stab a long-term colleague and friend in the back, and that's why they succeed compared to the normal, typical human. In terms of warning signs, red flags that a child might grow into something like a psychopath or a sociopath, there definitely are a few. There is aggression in early childhood, although I would say that that can be a red herring, because you can have a lot of aggressive children that either grow out of it or have other diagnoses such as antisocial personality disorder. I think what's probably more relevant is a lack of an emotional connection. So a child who might show affection towards but doesn't feel a deep bond or love towards their parents, towards their siblings, or even their friends, I think that is a clear telltale warning sign. So that doesn't necessarily mean they're a loner. They can be a bit of a social butterfly, but they don't really care. They don't have a deep empathy with anybody from childhood. Another warning flag would be very manipulative behavior. So a child that manages to entice other children around him or her to carry out their bidding, I think would be something we'd have to look out for. And also generally a lack of fear. So going into situations that other children would be terrified of doing, but they do that perhaps because they have a low threshold for boredom and they're the kind of kid that likes to seek thrills.
after Sylvia, who has by now fled with her son by Tobin, he takes up with a 15-year-old called Kathy Wilson, who is very much the shape of his desires to come. Very young, very innocent, very malleable, and very much Tobin's victim of choice. She bears him a child. They move from Bathgate in Scotland to Margate in Kent. This is a married man, now married 3 times, who entices 2 14-year-old schoolgirls to his house in Margate, plies them with alcohol, and attacks them.
The prosecution says this conviction and the fact that he murdered Vicky Hamilton show that he was a man with a propensity to abduct young girls, to administer the drug amitriptyline to them, murder them, and bury their bodies in rubbish sacks.
It's an act of grotesque horridness. Inevitably, however, they reported.
By discovering 2 young women's bodies buried in the back garden of this terraced house, the police were also discovering the truth about Peter Tobin. He is a serial sex attacker and killer.
So why don't women leave abusive partners? Why didn't Peter Tobin's wives leave him? Of course, the first one did. She left him reasonably soon. But why do partners stay with abusive men? Why do women stay with their psychopathic partners? And one has to understand what abuse does, what systematic, pervasive degradation does to one's sense of oneself. It degrades it. Every act of abuse disempowers the person who is abused. And the next act disempowers the person who is abused, but it's a compound disempowerment. It's not just 1 + 1 = 2. It's 1 + 1 = 3, 5, 10, 15. And the deeper and more pervasive the degradation is, the harder it is for the victim to muscle up the strength, the courage, the will, the self-esteem, the ability to leave.
And also, we can't forget that Peter Tobin was charming at times. You know, that's part of his makeup, that's part of his manipulation. So sometimes when people are in these kind of relationships with domestic violence, they focus on the nice periods, on the happy memories, on the charm of the perpetrator. And they can be convinced by the perpetrator that they will continue to be happy times. Some of Peter Tobin's girlfriends actually made excuses for him. Sometimes they even took the blame. So they said that he was just having a bad day or that it was actually their fault. And we have to ask why. I think he's brainwashed them to a degree. He's chipped away at their confidence over time, so they actually blame themselves. And maybe he's gaslit them as well. So he's made them question their own reality and made them think that they provoked him when clearly this wasn't the case.
And serial killers are quite common in this. If you try and leave, I will find you. If you say anything to anyone, I will find you and I will punish you. And when somebody is saying that, it closes that window, the only window these women have for escape, until eventually it's slammed shut. Peter Tobin was abusive to his first wife, as he was to all the women in his life. And one of the things he did, which again is something that's very common among serial killers, is he was abusive to animals. He slashed the throat of a little puppy in front of her and watched it bleed to death. And then as she protested, he raped and cut her inside her vagina with a knife to such a degree that the blood dripped into the flat below. So this was a man who knew no empathy and whose desire for control and his desire to torment and degrade those around him was an enormous impulse, which he along with other serial killers, exhibited in abundance.
There was an incident when one of Peter Tobin's girlfriends wanted to leave him, and he actually threatened to kill their own child in front of her. So this would have been a horrific ultimatum for her, and she stayed. Perhaps to her, that was the lesser of the two evils, because above all else, she wanted to protect her child. But the problem with that kind of relationship dynamic is it's unlikely to change. Once Tobin knows that he's got the upper hand, eventually that behaviour is likely to resurface, and that could be in the immediate future or it could be months down the line. Obviously, it's really hard to deal with that situation for the victim. It's difficult to navigate that kind of relationship. Personally, I would say that they have to leave because this behaviour is likely to resurface at some point, but they have to do it in a way that's the safest for them and their child. So invoking as less anger as possible from somebody like Tobin.
Kathy Wilson, Tobin's third wife, eventually escapes his clutches with her son, with their son. Tobin's effectively keeping her prisoner. But she flees to Portsmouth. And not long afterwards, Tobin moves to the south coast to Margate. And then for a time to Havant in Hampshire, which to be slightly nearer Portsmouth. I think under the pretense that he actually wants to see his son. I don't think Tobin's really got that much affection in his body. I think he's a deeply chilly man, and I think it was probably an excuse to move away from Scotland again.
I believe that Peter Tobin was a psychopath, and psychopaths can't really feel love. So he might have had affection for his girlfriends and his previous partners for short periods of time, but I don't think he deeply felt the emotional connection that you need for true love.
Empathy is having a sympathy with your fellow human being. In other words, you're capable of understanding their emotions, that they may be upset, hurt, angry. Someone who lacks empathy doesn't really care about any other human being's emotions except his or her own. So someone without empathy doesn't mind if you've broken your leg or have just recently broken up with your girlfriend or boyfriend. They don't care about that. The only person they're interested in, and that's what true lack of empathy means, is themselves. They're totally themselves. They're obsessed with their own needs and desires.
Empathy is distinctive for psychopaths by its absence. There were some studies done and looking at the limbic system and the amygdala, basically the emotional centers of the brain, when psychopaths and people far on the psychopathic spectrum were shown terrifying images, like horrific images. And whereas most people, the amygdala would be lighting up and we'd all be, I'm showing extremes of emotional response. For the psychopath, it was just darkness, complete darkness.
The amygdala is a tiny part of the brain that processes fearful and threatening stimuli. It is the part of the limbic system that controls emotions, including aggression. The limbic system is the part of the brain that deals with emotions and behaviors, particularly behaviors that are related to our survival instincts. So for example, reproduction, feeding our young, and the fight or flight response.
For a normal person, empathy is just the ability to care, to love for someone else, to put yourself in someone else's shoes, and to see their lives, their emotions, their careers, their families, their beliefs, their values, to see that as important, to care for them when they're wounded, to make sure that if they're emotionally hurt, that you're capable of understanding that hurt and soothing that hurt. Whereas for a psychopath, of course, all that is absent because human beings only exist as a means to an end, which is their own self-gratification.
Are psychopath evils? There is this notion about their lack of empathy and their lack of remorse, but is that something that makes them evil, or is this more of an evil act? Because most of the time they are in your everyday life and they are not nasty just for the sake of it. But when they are doing their killing, this is when really you can see that sort of evil side to them. You will have people labeling serial killers as all being evils, when really that's more about the evil actions, because they're not evil all the time.
A 10-year prison sentence does nothing to quell Tobin's desires. In fact, if anything, it sharpens them. Unknown to the police, when he's finally charged and convicted of the attack on 2 schoolgirls, Peter Tobin has already killed an 18-year-old schoolgirl called Dahmer McNichol from Hampshire, whom he's literally abducted. He's offered her a lift. She's taken it, and she's paid with her life.
Dinah's fateful journey had started with this man, David Tremlett. He'd been dropped off at a junction of the M25. She'd carried on.
Eventually, her body will be discovered in the house that Tobin lived in Margate. But at that point, she's simply a schoolgirl who's disappeared. She disappears, Tobin attacks the 2 girls, is sent to jail. Jail does nothing to change his proclivities. Tobin, if anything, becomes more determined to attack young girls than he was before. He's brutal, relentless, and in every way, horrifying.
Experts are using radar devices to locate what they call hotspots, points in the structure of the building where there's been deliberate movement, perhaps for home improvements, perhaps for something much more sinister.
The hole was so deep that one had joked it looked as if he was digging for Australia. In fact, Peter Tobin had said he was digging a sandpit for his son. When it was filled in a few days later, he told that same neighbour social services had said it would be dangerous. It was, said William Clegg QC, an obvious lie.
The true evil of this man was summed up in court as he was convicted of murder for the 3rd time. Peter Tobin joked with a neighbour about digging a sandpit for his son, when in fact he was digging a grave.
One of the terms that's often used about psychopaths is they're evil, which of course has a deeply theological or religious connotation, as if there is some primal evil. But what a psychopath is essentially is a human being where perhaps the amygdala and the limbic system, the emotional centers of the brain, are not functioning normally. That has been exacerbated by chaotic and violent and abusive, often violent and abusive childhoods. And that combination, produces this human being who becomes a mass murderer, a killer, a cold-blooded killer. I mean, evil is a term that is indeed appropriate for many psychopaths, but we need to understand the clinical foundation of that and the psychological foundation of that.
Tobin had moved to Margate in Kent a month after he'd attacked her. He'd taken her body with him, cut her in half and buried her in bin bags in the garden.
So from the moment where there have been studies looking at criminality, there has been this need for finding where it comes from. So finding the gene for criminality has been something that a lot of neuroscientists have looked at. And it's not something that has been found. And to be fair, it is something that would also be very dangerous in terms of, even if there was a gene, does that mean that this gene would be active and that the person would go on to committing crime? No, not necessarily. That's why also when I explain about psychopathy, that you can have successful psychopaths who are not going to commit any crimes during their lives. This is where it is the same in terms of maybe the gene of criminality. If they are in an environment where this is not going to help to develop any criminal career.
I wouldn't say that being a psychopath is genetic. You don't inherit a psychopath gene, but you can inherit certain traits that are related to psychopathy, like impulsivity or aggression or a lack of empathy. I think what's far more relevant is the earlier social circumstances of a child or an adolescent that grows into a psychopath. So what I'm saying is, it's more nurture than it is nature.
always hesitated to say that anyone was born evil. But there are times when I'm asked to confront my own liberal intellect and say, you may well be wrong. I've always believed that redemption is possible. I've always believed that rehabilitation is possible. But I can think of now countless examples when it simply isn't. Was Peter Tobin born evil? I don't think so. Is there such a thing as a killing gene? I doubt it, but I'm perfectly prepared to admit, and admit at once, that there are exceptions, and that sometimes those exceptions prove my rule. There are some people who simply are irredeemable. But did they grow into that? Or was it their own nature? This is the argument as old as criminology. In September 2006, not that long after his release from prison in 2004, Tobin is working as a handyman at a church in Glasgow. He's calling himself Pat McLaughlin. Also living at the church, in the presbytery of the church at that time, was a Polish student called Angelica Kluk, who is young. She's working with the church. She's very much Tobin's appetite. And Tobin obviously targets her. The last time she's seen, in 2006, she's with Pat, the handyman, working in the garage next to the presbytery. She disappears. In fact, she falls into the hands of Tobin.
This should have been a day of worship here at St Patrick's Church, but instead the building remains a crime scene, sealed off and guarded by police. And today brought the news that the people who laid those floral tributes were expecting but dreading that the body found hidden underneath the floorboards here was indeed that of the missing Polish student.
We offer our sympathy to the family of Angelica, whose body was found in the church. It has been confirmed that she has been murdered.
Local church worshippers this morning spoke of their shock and grief at her brutal murder.
I feel safe when you're inside the church. Don't think of anything like this happening. It's absolutely dreadful.
And Angelica was a very nice girl.
She's strangled and stabbed, and she's buried while still alive under the floorboards next to the altar in the church, next to the confessional and the altar in the church. Now, some people have suggested there was a religious motive to that killing. I don't think there was, but the fact that he was from an Irish Catholic family, it was a Catholic church, there's obviously some religious element in there. I think it was a crime of opportunity. I think he targeted her, and I think he was so callous, so cruel, that the fact that she might still have been alive when he buried her under the floorboards didn't occur to him. It was irrelevant. She was simply a piece of meat by that point to him. It's still a crime that literally sends a shiver down my spine.
Sadly, I have to inform you that following the post-mortem examination this afternoon, Angelica's death has now been treated as murder. All I can say it was a horrific and very, very violent attack on a young lady.
One of the factors that people believe is foundational to psychopathic serial killers is the motive is sexual, and rape and sexual violence is common to many serial killers, including, for example, Peter Tobin, who horrendously raped and abused many people, many of his victims, not all of whom he killed. But we have to understand that it's not sexual gratification in the way that perhaps normal people would understand sexual gratification, that is the driving impulse here, but it's power. It's the need of the psychopath to have control, to have complete control over someone else's life and someone else's behavior, and the gratification that that gives them.
So there has been some studies looking at what are the emotions felt by homicide offenders when they are killing. And most studies are more emphasizing on the negative emotions that are felt, such as guilt, such as shame, such as depression, anxiety, and the fact that they have, having to deal with having taken a life, something that they can never make up for. Only a few studies have talked about also some of the affects that they found positive in terms of thrill, in terms of that sort of rush of adrenaline that they felt when they killed. But not all have these sorts of emotions. So it's only in certain types of killing and certain types of killer who are feeling this thrill, excitement at the perspective of killing or when they have killed.
So in terms of the actual pleasure and the thrill that a serial killer feels, it depends on what category they are. Disorganized serial killers tend to have this frenzy that needs to be quenched, whereas organized killers tend to enjoy the entire process, from the planning to the killing itself, to even taking little souvenirs with them so they can relive the experience. But for both categories, there's both a fear and an excitement intertwined. So there's the fear that something might go wrong or they might be caught by the police later. And of course, for many serial killers, especially males, there's a sexual gratification in the act itself. Serial killers can be categorized broadly into disorganized and organized. Disorganized serial killers tend to live on the fringes of society, much like sociopaths, and they tend to be kind of creepy and a little bit odd. They can't blend into society very easily. They tend to struggle in many aspects of their life, so they don't have many close relationships. They can't really hold down a job. The reason that they're called disorganized serial killers is because they don't plan ahead for their murders. They have this bloodlust, this murderous rage, and they need to discharge it. Whereas organized serial killers take a lot more time meticulously planning what they're going to do and how they're going to get away with it. What's quite interesting is which one is easier to catch. With an organized serial killer, even though they meticulously plan it, so it's harder to catch them per event, it's easier to establish a pattern because there is common ground and there are massive similarities between the victims they choose and the murders they carry out. Whereas disorganized killers, they don't really have a pattern by their very nature, so that makes them much harder to catch by the police.
One of the questions that we all have to confront when we come across a human being who has committed an extraordinary litany of crimes. It could be somebody who was a concentration camp guard at Auschwitz. It could be a war criminal. It could be somebody who is a serial killer or a psychopath who has murdered and butchered many people. And people say, well, can you have empathy? Can you have for these people? And we have to be very clear here about what we mean by empathy. It simply means, perhaps in this sense, it's important that we understand these people. To simply demonize someone as evil doesn't help us to understand what motivates these people to do that. And if we don't understand, we can't protect ourselves and the wider society from these behavior patterns in the future. Of course, when it comes to broader criminality, we can even look at killers. I mean, not all killers by any stretch of the imagination are psychopaths. There are plenty of people who commit murder and who commit lesser crimes who feel very remorseful and who genuinely empathize with their victims and seek to put their wrongs right. These are not psychopaths, and we can perhaps more readily understand these people. But in the emotional darkness that constitutes the emotional life of a psychopath, it's very difficult to have what we would normally mean by empathy, but it's important that we have as much understanding as we can, because we need to understand this predatory, compulsive, violent behavior so that we may stop it in the future, or at least give ourselves as much protection as we can.
When you read about trauma and horrible environment and horrible treatment that some of the serial killers received when they were children, you then sometimes think, well, they really had all of these risk factors accumulating, and if only something or someone had been there to try and stop that, then hopefully they wouldn't have gone on to committing these crimes. So you do feel like it is a shame, but then also there are many other people who have had horrendous life condition and who do not go on to committing serial killings.
Do you believe anyone is born evil?
No, I don't think that anyone is born evil. I think it's really a mix between biological and genetic factors that are predisposing someone, but then that is really also the situational, the environmental factor, the circumstances that combination will lead into committing sometimes evil crimes.
Pat McLaughlin, also known as Peter Tobin, disappears again. He goes back to the south coast. Partly, I think, to see his son, who's still there with his second wife. But then, as ever, he abducts another young woman called Vicky Hamilton. Takes her back to the house in Margate, kills her, cuts her body up, puts it in black bin bags. All this time, he's still got the body of Dinah McNichol, by now severely decomposed, and he digs a hole in his house in Margate, and he explains to the neighbours that he's building a sand pit for his son when he visits. It's bizarre and untrue, of course, and he buries both bodies, Dinah McNichol and Vicky Hamilton. So he's killed Angelica Kluk, Dinah McNichol, Vicky Hamilton, and shown not a shred of remorse, guilt, anxiety. On the contrary.
The Association of Chief Police Officers has launched what's called a scoping exercise, looking at Tobin's movements in relation to any deaths and disappearances still on police files.
Experts are using radar devices to locate what they call hotspots, points in the structure of the building where there's been deliberate movement, perhaps for home improvements, perhaps for something much more sinister.
The jury then heard that neighbours had actually seen Peter Tobin digging a deep hole in the summer of 1991.
Tobin had moved to Margate in Kent a month after he'd attacked her. He'd taken her body with him, cut her in half and buried her in bin bags in the garden.
By one of the strange ironies of fate that's happened so often in cases like this, Tobin is actually charged with something completely different from all this. He has a problem with knives, and his DNA is found on a particular weapon, and he's arrested and charged. The police then launch a search for victims, and they search his house in Margate, where they discover, eventually, the bodies of 2 girls.
Peter Tobin will have walked this path. It leads to what was his backyard. There are police search teams there now, and several large holes they've been digging. The blue tarpaulin covers the shallow grave where they found 15-year-old Vicky Hamilton's body.
Convicted killer Peter Tobin, already serving life for murdering a schoolgirl, now begins a trial in Chelmsford for murdering another young woman. In this case, like the first, he's said to have abducted, drugged and dismembered his victim.
At the same time, the police launched what's known as Operation Anagram, which is an attempt to discover how many other victims Tobin might have had. While at the same time, they're still investigating the disappearance of Angelica Kluk, whose body is found. Well, it soon becomes abundantly clear that Pat McLaughlin and Peter Tobin are one and the same man. And indeed, Angelica is this third victim. I think in sentencing him, the judge said he was sentenced in England but told to serve his time in Scotland in a Scottish prison. He was a man who couldn't exist in a civilised society, should not exist in a civilised society. He was a man of such evil intent that he would clearly kill again, given half a chance. Tobin is the sort of man who could not be allowed to remain at large because no one, particularly no young woman or teenage girl, was safe. There is no question that there were other killings by Peter Tobin, but in fact Operation Anagram didn't find any conclusive proof of further victims. But so many young people disappear every year. It's very difficult to know and track all of them down. I'm always been convinced in my own mind that Tobin was a relentless killer, but that some of the victims will simply never be found.
The body and the personal effects have been identified as Vicky Hamilton, who went missing in February 1991 from Bathgate in Scotland. Vicky's family and Diana's family have been informed.
Vicky was much more than the girl who was abducted and killed by a stranger, or a girl on a missing poster. Our sister was warm, clever, generous, a generous girl who shared many happy years with us. We will always remember Vicky as she lived, not as she died. Thank you.
Today, in Scotland, Vicky Hamilton's father walked with a police officer in front of the secure vehicle carrying the man who used to live in that house in Margate, the man who has now been charged with his daughter's murder.
This is Peter Tobin, a convicted killer serving life, who the prosecution says has a track record of drugging and killing teenage girls, and is the man who killed Dinah McNichol.
When Tobin is eventually charged with the murders, he offers no defence and is given a whole life term of imprisonment. There was no defence. There could be no defence. He was, needless to say, attacked in prison and suffered eventually a stroke and died.
Many psychopaths exhibit paraphilic behaviour, which means they have unusual sexual orientations, and they take them to an extreme, Their sadism is extreme. Another paraphilic behaviour might be masochism, voyeurism, fetishism. Of course, some of these behaviours are widely distributed through the population, but again, in psychopaths, they're simply taken to an extreme.
He was addicted to sadomasochism. So some prostitutes have said of him when they knew who he was. He was a man for whom it's very difficult to feel the slightest warmth. One of those people, if you met, you'd probably try and avoid. There was something about him. As I said at the beginning, he didn't have horns, or a tail, or a black cloak. But my goodness me, he was the devil incarnate.